The hum of the servers, a low, steady breath, was the only constant companion in my world of numbers. It was a familiar rhythm, a quiet assurance that order, however complex, ultimately prevailed. My name is Thomas, and for years my craft had been the meticulous unraveling of financial tapestries, seeking the faint, almost invisible threads of truth within the vast weave of transactions. My office, a precise rectangle of glass and steel high above the city's restless sprawl, was my sanctuary, a place where logic reigned supreme. Today, the light, usually so crisp and impartial, felt different, casting long, unsettling shadows across my twin monitors. I was deep within the digital ledgers of Argent Global Logistics, a firm whose colossal shipping operations spanned continents. Their accounts, a sprawling network of debits and credits, normally flowed with the predictable currents of global trade. I was conducting a routine quarterly audit, a task I could often perform with a near-instinctual grace, my fingers dancing across the keyboard, my eyes scanning for the faintest tremor in the data. It began subtly, a whisper in the financial wind. A series of small, almost insignificant transactions. A dozen payments, each under a reporting threshold, routed through a seemingly unrelated shell corporation registered in a distant island nation. Nothing overtly illegal, perhaps, but the pattern itself was a discordant note in the symphony of Argent's usual operations. My brow furrowed, a tiny crease forming between my eyes as I cross-referenced the dates, the beneficiaries, the amounts. They were too uniform, too perfectly staggered, like pebbles laid out by a meticulous, unseen hand. Just an oversight, I murmured to the empty air, trying to soothe the nascent prickle of unease. A clumsy clerical error. I'd seen them before, these minor aberrations, the inevitable human imperfections in a system designed for machine-like precision. But my gut, that quiet, insistent oracle that had guided me through countless audits, stirred. It was not a clumsy error. It felt deliberate. I traced the payments backward, peeling back layers of digital obfuscation. The shell corporation, Ocean's Vale Holdings, had no discernible physical presence, no public records beyond its barebones incorporation documents. Its listed director, a proxy, appeared on the boards of dozens of similar phantom entities. A chill, faint at first, began to seep into my bones. This was not the sloppy work of an amateur. This was the elegant architecture of something far more sophisticated. The transactions, ostensibly for consulting services and logistical support, connected to a series of smaller, regional shipping companies that were, in turn, subsidiaries of Argent Global Logistics. Yet the services described were vague, the payments disproportionate to any tangible deliverable I could identify. My fingers flew across the keyboard, opening new windows, cross-referencing industry benchmarks, comparing invoices. The more I dug, the more the tidy facade of routine business began to crack. A sudden, sharp ping from my internal messaging system startled me. It was from the senior partner, the firm's imposing figurehead, a man whose presence filled any room he entered. His message was brief, almost curt. "Thomas, progress report on Argent. Confident we're on track for a clean bill of health." My fingers hovered over the keyboard, a strange tremor running through them. A clean bill of health. That was the expectation. That was the demand. My gaze drifted back to the screen, to the intricate web of deceit I was slowly untangling. Argent Global Logistics was one of the firm's most lucrative clients, a cornerstone of our prestige, and I was finding rot at its core. I typed a reply, carefully choosing my words. "Still in the weeds, sir. A few minor discrepancies I'm clarifying. Nothing major to report yet." The lie felt heavy on my tongue, a stone dropped into the quiet pool of my integrity. But to voice my suspicions now without absolute certainty would be professional suicide or worse. I continued my silent excavation. The small transactions, when aggregated, formed a river, and that river flowed into a larger stream, a single, enormous payment to an offshore account in the Caymans, an account linked, of something ancient and ruthless. My breath hitched. This was no mere accounting error, no clumsy embezzlement. I was no detective, no hardened investigator. I was a man of ledgers, of logic, of predictable outcomes. Yet the numbers on my screen screamed a truth that transcended mere finance. It was a truth steeped in danger, a truth that threatened to shatter the very glass walls of my ordered world. I leaned back, running a hand through my hair, my eyes still fixed on the screen. The office, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The steady hum of the servers, once a comfort, now seemed to mock me, a drone of unseen surveillance. I had stumbled upon something vast, something terrible, and the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was utterly alone in this discovery. I thought of my family, their faces flashing through my mind like a desperate prayer. The innocent laughter of my child, the quiet strength in my partner's eyes. These were the anchors of my existence, the precious things I sought to protect. And now, I had inadvertently pulled back a curtain on a world where such innocence was devoured. My initial instinct was to shout, to run, to expose this cancerous growth. But the senior partner's message echoed in my mind, confident we're on track for a clean bill of health. It wasn't just an inquiry, it was a veiled command. The firm, my firm, was complicit or, at the very least, willfully blind. To report this internally would be to walk into a den of wolves, to expose myself to the very forces I was trying to unmask. A tremor of self-doubt ran through me. Had I misinterpreted the data? I rechecked every calculation, every cross-reference, every anomaly. No, the numbers didn't lie even if the world around them did. The pattern was too clear, too deliberate. The river of illicit funds flowed with an undeniable current. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing the vastness of the ocean, the countless ships crisscrossing its surface, carrying their legitimate cargo. But now I saw something else. Ghost ships, laden with invisible, poisoned wealth, moving silently beneath the radar. When I opened my eyes, the decision was made. I could not simply close the file, erase the data, and pretend I hadn't seen. My meticulous nature, my dedication to truth, would not allow it. I was a forensic accountant and the numbers had spoken. They had revealed a glitch in the system, a gaping wound in the fabric of legitimate commerce, and I, Thomas, was the one who had seen it bleed. The game had changed. And I, the quiet man of ledgers, was now a reluctant player. The ledger, a silent testament to meticulous deceit, lay open beneath my lamp's focused beam. Argent Global Logistics. The name, once a mere entry in a database, now hummed with a sinister energy, a wasp nest disturbed. My fingers, still faintly trembling from the night's revelations, traced the impossible figures, the phantom transactions that bled across borders like oil on water. The phrase echoed, hollow and mocking, from the pristine walls of my office. My firm, a bastion of probity, was compromised. I felt it in the chill that settled beneath my skin, a cold premonition that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I had always believed in the elegant purity of numbers, their unwavering truth. They spoke a language devoid of bias, revealing patterns where chaos seemed to reign. And these numbers, stark and undeniable, screamed betrayal. I compiled my findings with a surgeon's precision, each discrepancy highlighted, each shell corporation unmasked, each irregular payment flagged. I printed the summary, a slender stack of paper that felt heavier than lead, and placed it inside a manila folder. The system, I told myself, would correct itself. The firm, my firm, would want to know. The senior partner's office was a study in muted power, polished mahogany, leather-bound volumes, a panoramic view of the city that seemed to shrink the world below into insignificance. He sat behind his immense desk, a figure of composed authority, his smile a practiced curve that reached his eyes only partially. "Thomas," he greeted, his voice a smooth baritone, "come in. What brings you here with such a?" They appear to be indicative of a sophisticated money laundering operation. His gaze, steady and unblinking, fell upon the folder. He didn't pick it up immediately. Argent, yes, a substantial client. Complex dealings, naturally, given their international reach. The complexities, sir, extend beyond standard logistics. I've found evidence of shell companies in various jurisdictions, unusual payment structures, and significant discrepancies between reported cargo and actual manifest data. I spoke with a measured calm, each word a carefully placed stone in a logical pathway. I expected a flicker of alarm, a demand for details. Instead, he leaned back, a faint sigh escaping him. "Thomas, you are, without question, one of our most thorough forensic accountants. Your attention to detail is commendable." His words were a silken rope, flattering yet subtly binding. However, the global landscape of commerce is, by its very nature, often opaque. What appears irregular to a domestic lens can often be standard practice in certain international markets. My throat tightened. "Sir, these aren't minor discrepancies. The figures suggest millions, potentially hundreds of millions, are being illicitly moved through this operation. It's not just a matter of opaque practices. It's a clear pattern of criminal activity." He finally picked up the folder, his fingers, manicured and strong, flipping through the pages with a deliberate slowness that felt like a performance. He paused on a page where I had meticulously mapped out the flow of funds through a series of shell corporations. His eyes scanned the diagram, but I saw no genuine interest, no shock, only a mild, almost weary acknowledgement. "I appreciate your diligence, Thomas, truly. But sometimes, in our pursuit of absolute clarity, we risk overlooking the broader strategic partnerships that sustain a firm of our stature. Argent Global, for all its unique operational methods, is integral to several larger consortiums with whom we have long-standing, mutually beneficial relationships." The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on me. "Are you suggesting we overlook potential criminal activity for the sake of a client relationship?" The question felt sharp, cutting through the polite veneer. His eyes, now cool and unreadable, met mine. "I am suggesting, Thomas, that sometimes a zealous pursuit of every-minute detail can inadvertently destabilize a delicate ecosystem. Your career, your future here, is very promising. We value your intellect, your drive. But discretion, a nuanced understanding of the bigger picture, is also a crucial asset in leadership roles." He set the folder down, closing it with a soft thud. "Perhaps, for now, we allow the Argent account to continue its current trajectory. We can revisit this in due course. There are other, less sensitive matters requiring your considerable talents, I'm sure." The dismissal was polite, almost paternal, yet it carried the weight of a stone dropped into a deep well. It wasn't a rejection of my findings, it was an acceptance of the corruption. He wasn't just downplaying it, he was actively protecting it. My breath hitched. The labyrinth, I realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't just outside the firm. It was woven into its very foundation. A sudden, disorienting shift occurred within my perception. The polished office walls wavered. The hum of the air conditioning morphed into a deeper, resonant thrum. The scent of leather and expensive wood vanished, replaced by the metallic tang of salt and rust. The rhythmic groan of stressed metal, the slap of unseen waves against a hull, the distant, muffled shriek of a gantry crane, these sounds enveloped me. I was in a cargo ship hold, 3 days from port, the air thick with the smell of diesel and the unspoken weight of illicit goods. The space was immense, a cavernous maw filled with stacked containers, their bolted seams like stitches on a monstrous hide. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the vision receded. The senior partner's unblinking gaze was still fixed on me, the city skyline still framed by his window. But the world had irrevocably changed. I had walked in seeking justice, armed with truth. I walked out with a profound, terrifying understanding. I was now utterly alone, and the truth I held was not a key but a target. My resolve hardened, a fragile steel against the encroaching fear. The game had just begun. The polite dismissal, a veneer of professional courtesy, still scraped against my skin like coarse sandpaper. Current trajectory. The words of the senior partner, smooth as polished stone, had been a chisel, not a reassurance. He wasn't just downplaying it, he was actively pushing it into the abyss, sealing the truth beneath layers of corporate indifference. My initial report, a carefully constructed edifice of numbers and anomalies, had been deconstructed, its foundation undermined not by logic but by a chilling, unspoken decree. This was no mere oversight, no bureaucratic tangle. This was deliberate. My firm, the very bastion of financial integrity I had dedicated years to, was compromised. The revelation hit me with a force that stole my breath, a silent, internal gasp. The air in my office, usually crisp with the hum of electronics, now felt thick, cloying like dust motes dancing in the final rays of a dying sun. I sat there, the glow of my monitor reflecting the weary lines etched around my eyes. The initial tremor of fear, a fleeting shiver, gave way to a hardened resolve. Retreat was not an option, not when the shadow of something so vast, so malignant, stretched across my professional landscape. The numbers whispered to me, an insistent chorus of discrepancies and diversions. They were not just figures on a ledger. They were breadcrumbs leading into a labyrinth, and I, Thomas, was compelled to follow. I worked from a hidden partition on my personal laptop, a ghost in the machine, sifting through public records databases, cross-referencing them with the sanitized versions provided by the firm. It was a painstaking process, like trying to reconstruct a shattered vase from a handful of shards. I started with the periphery, the shell companies I'd flagged, the ones with obscure addresses and directors who seemed to vanish into the ether after a year. Their names, often generic and forgettable, began to coalesce into a pattern. There was Global Nexus Logistics, a name both grand and vague, registered in a jurisdiction known for its opacity. On paper, it was a modest import-export operation, dealing in bulk commodities, textiles, raw materials, processed foods, nothing overtly suspicious. Yet its financial footprint was far too large for its declared activities. The revenue streams were disproportionately high for the volume of goods it supposedly handled. This was my "wait, that doesn't add up" moment. The numbers were too clean, too perfect, like a photograph airbrushed to erase every flaw. I pulled up archived shipping manifests, cross-referencing them with the firm's internal payment systems, looking for the phantom limb of a transaction, the ghost in the machine. Coffee became my constant companion, a bitter, welcome friend. And then I found it. A series of payments from Global Nexus Logistics to a smaller, even more obscure entity called Oceanic Pathways, Inc. This company, barely a blip on the radar, seemed to exist solely to facilitate shipping for Global Nexus. Its invoices were sparse, records even more so. But one entry buried deep within a quarterly report snagged my attention like a burr on a wool coat. It was a manifest for a single colossal shipment. The cargo, miscellaneous industrial components. The destination, a remote port known more for its fishing fleet than its international trade. The words hung in the digital air, stark and immediate, 3 days from port. This wasn't a historical anomaly, it was a current event. The numbers, once abstract, now painted a vivid, unsettling picture. Miscellaneous industrial components was a convenient, generic label, a catch-all for anything one wished to conceal. The value declared for this immense shipment was shockingly low, almost negligible compared to the cost of chartering a vessel of that size. This discrepancy screamed louder than any alarm bell. My mind raced, connecting the dots. This wasn't just money laundering through shell corporations. It was a sophisticated pipeline moving something tangible, something illicit under the guise of legitimate trade. The scale was breathtaking, terrifying. I wasn't just auditing books anymore. I was peering into the heart of a beast. The Triton's call, its hold laden with secrets, was a moving target, a floating vault of illicit wealth. What could I, a forensic accountant armed only with spreadsheets, do against such a formidable, mobile operation? The truth, I realized, was not just in the numbers, but out there, somewhere on the vast, indifferent ocean. And I, Thomas, had just found its coordinates. The hunt had truly begun. He wasn't just downplaying it, he was actively pushing it into the abyss, a gaping maw I refused to let swallow my findings. My resolve, a brittle shard of glass, hardened in the aftermath, transforming into something far more resilient. The fluorescent hum of my office, a steady, irritating drone, became my nocturnal companion. Each evening, as the last of my colleagues drifted into the city's indifferent embrace, I would unearth the files once more. The figures, a sprawling tapestry of deceit, stretched before me across the monitor's cool glow. I traced the flow of phantom funds, a digital river coursing through a labyrinth of shell corporations, each one a dead end designed to obscure its true source. But I saw the patterns, the subtle, almost imperceptible eddies where the current twisted unnaturally. My fingers danced across the keyboard, a relentless ballet of data entry and cross-referencing, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a growing, unsettling certainty. One particular thread pulled at me, a recurring series of payments to a shell entity named Deepwater Logistics. The name itself was a cliché, almost brazen in its lack of imagination, yet the sums involved were anything but trivial. They were colossal, laundered through layers of legitimate-looking invoices for services never rendered. Diving deeper, past the superficial ledger entries, I found a singular, recurring note in their internal accounting system, a destination code paired with a vague identifier. After hours of digging through open-source shipping databases and port manifests, the pieces clicked into place with an alarming thud. The identifier wasn't vague, it was precise. It spoke of a vessel, its current location, and its cargo. A cold dread, sharp as a sudden draft, snaked through me as the data coalesced into a single, stark image in my mind. A cargo ship hold 3 days from port. The realization solidified, a tangible destination for the dirty money, a physical manifestation of the digital ghost I'd been chasing. The following morning, the world outside my window seemed subtly altered. The usual rhythm of the city felt off-kilter, a drumbeat suddenly out of sync. Its windows were tinted, opaque mirrors reflecting the gray sky. I dismissed it as a coincidence, a stranger waiting for a passenger. Yet the same sedan seemed to linger at the next intersection, its presence a faint, almost imperceptible hum against the backdrop of morning traffic. Imagination, I told myself, a weary echo of the senior partner's dismissive tone. Inside the office, the air felt heavier. My desk, usually a pristine expanse of organized chaos, held a faint, unfamiliar scent, a metallic tang like old coins. A small, insignificant detail, yet it snagged at my attention. Had I left the window ajar? No, the latch was firm. A flicker of unease, a featherlight brush against my skin made me glance at the small, framed photo of my family. Their smiles, usually a balm, now felt like a fragile shield. Later, during a quick lunch break, I found myself in the bustling market district. The crowds were thick, a river of humanity. I stopped at a stall, eyeing a display of vibrant fruits when a shadow fell across my peripheral vision. Our eyes met for a fleeting, uncomfortable second. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't break eye contact until I, unnerved, turned away. When I looked back, he was gone, swallowed by the crowd as if he'd never been there. Wait, that doesn't add up. The speed of his disappearance, the unnatural stillness before, the unnerving blankness. That evening, as I painstakingly reviewed the Deepwater Logistics files again, the phone on my desk gave a soft, almost inaudible ring. It was an internal line, but the display showed an unknown extension. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. My heart, against my will, began to tap a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I answered. A low, almost imperceptible static hummed on the line like a distant ocean. Then a click. The line went dead. It was more unsettling than any explicit threat could have been. It was a statement. The metallic tang, that faint scent from the morning, seemed stronger now, clinging to the air. My gaze drifted to the small security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling, usually an ignored fixture. Had it always been angled exactly like that? A sudden, unwelcome doubt, a small, insidious worm began to gnaw. Was I seeing things? Was the pressure getting to me? No, the numbers didn't lie. The cargo ship hold 3 days from port wasn't a phantom. The blank gaze in the market wasn't a trick of the light. The silent phone call wasn't a wrong number. These were deliberate acts, carefully orchestrated, designed to unnerve, to warn. They were telling me to stop, to retreat from the precipice I was unknowingly approaching. My hand went to the desk, finding the cool, smooth surface of a small, worn stone I kept there, a gift from my daughter. Its simple weight grounded me. My determination, briefly wavering, solidified once more. I wouldn't back down, not now. Not when I was so close to understanding where the tide of illicit wealth truly flowed. I was no longer merely observing the currents. I was caught in them, and the waters were rising. The steel ribs of the vessel groaned a mournful hymn around me, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very soles of my shoes. I stood in the cavernous expanse of the cargo ship hold, the air thick with the scent of brine and forgotten things, a metallic tang that clung to my tongue. 3 days from port, the captain had said, his voice a gravelly rumble lost in the vastness. 3 days. Each tick of the ship's internal clock an echo of the senior partner's dismissive words, current trajectory, now felt less like a path forward and more like a descent into an abyss of my own making. How had I come to this cold, echoing tomb? A breadcrumb trail meticulously laid, promising a physical ledger, a crucial piece of the puzzle that my digital probes could not unearth. The anonymous message had been precise, detailing a rendezvous point at a remote dock, a specific container number. Foolish, perhaps, but the need to find something concrete, something undeniable, had gnawed at me. Now the heavy hatch was bolted shut behind me, a stark, metallic finality. I was alone, truly alone, adrift on an indifferent sea, the rhythmic pulse of the engines a constant reminder of my isolation. It had vibrated once, a silent tremor I almost missed over the ship's endless drone. The screen glowed, a harsh beacon in the dimness. It was a photograph. My breath hitched, a jagged shard in my throat. The image was mundane, innocuous at first glance. A park bench, familiar in its chipped green paint beneath the sprawling canopy of an old oak. And then I saw her, my daughter. Her small, bright figure, a blur of motion as she chased a pigeon, her laughter, I could almost hear it, a delicate chime in the afternoon sun. He was wearing the pink jacket I'd bought her last month. But then my gaze snagged on a detail, a tiny, almost imperceptible intrusion into the picture's innocent tableau. On the very edge of the bench, nestled amidst a scattering of fallen leaves, was a single crimson rose. It wasn't a wild rose or one plucked from a local garden. This was a hothouse bloom, perfectly formed, its petals almost unnaturally vibrant against the dull wood. And it was positioned with deliberate precision, its stem resting exactly where she always placed her small backpack when she paused for breath. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. The air in the hold grew thin, suffocating. The photograph wasn't just a picture, it was a testament. They knew her park, they knew her routine. They had been there. The rose, a morbid punctuation mark, a signature of intent, or redirected. The word struck me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. My illusion of safety, a flimsy gauze I had clung to despite the rising tide of threats, shattered into a million glittering fragments. It wasn't just my career they wanted to bury, or my life they threatened to extinguish. It was the warmth of my home, the innocent joy of my daughter, the quiet strength of my wife. They were not just an obstacle to be removed. They were pawns in a game I hadn't fully comprehended until this moment. My mind raced, a frantic hummingbird beating against the cage of my skull. Had she been alone, there was someone watching her still. Had the rose been placed before or after she left? It was the fear of a father, primal and absolute. I tried to call my wife, my thumb fumbling with the keys, but the signal here, deep within the steel belly of the ship, was non-existent. The call wouldn't connect. Every calculation, every risk assessment, every cautious step I had taken to expose the truth suddenly seemed laughably naive. I had believed I could control the narrative, that my anonymity was a shield. The fear, however, was a transient thing. It burned, yes, a searing agony, but from its ashes rose something else, something sharper, harder. a fierce, unyielding determination. This was no longer about abstract justice, about balancing the scales of corporate malfeasance. This was about survival, about protecting the fragile, precious laughter of my daughter, about safeguarding the quiet sanctuary of my home. They had drawn a line in the sand, etched it with a crimson rose, and I, Thomas, the cautious number cruncher, would cross it. My hands, which once only tallied figures, now clenched into fists. The thrum of the ship, once a monotonous drone, now felt like a drumbeat, a call to arms. I didn't know how I would escape this floating prison or what I would do when I reached land. But one thing was clear: I would not just expose them, I would dismantle them piece by agonizing piece. The hunter had become the hunted, but a cornered animal I knew was the most dangerous of all. They had shown me their hand. Now it was time to show them mine. The steel walls of the cargo ship hold breathed a cold, metallic sigh around me, a constant, low thrum against my skull. 3 days from port, the captain had snarled, a fleeting glimpse of his craggy face before the hatch clanged shut, plunging me back into this metal tomb. The air was thick with the brine of the ocean and the acrid tang of diesel, a cocktail that coated my tongue and burned in my nostrils. Each subtle shift of the hull, each groan of the massive vessel, was a reminder of my isolation, a tiny cork adrift on an indifferent sea. My illusion of safety, a flimsy gauze I had clung to despite the rising tide of threats, had shattered into a million glittering fragments. It wasn't just my career they wanted to bury, or my life they threatened to extinguish. It was everything. I ran a hand over the rough canvas of the sack that served as my pillow, a meager comfort in the vast, echoing space. My mind, usually so precise, so ordered in its pursuit of numbers and anomalies, felt like a storm-tossed ledger, pages ripped and scattered. The threats, the veiled warnings from my superior, the way my internal reports had vanished into thin air, it had all culminated in this. A hasty escape, a desperate scramble onto this floating behemoth, arranged by a contact whose face I barely remembered, a shadow in a dim alley. I was a ghost, a refugee from my own life, and the knowledge of it gnawed at me, sharper than any hunger pang. The syndicate, like a parasitic vine, had woven itself through the very fabric of my world. My initial belief that the truth, presented clearly and meticulously, would be enough, now seemed laughably naive. And I, Thomas, the meticulous number cruncher, had become an inconvenient noise. The realization had come like a sudden, brutal awakening. I could not fight this alone. My fingers brushed against the small, heavy weight in my pocket, a satellite phone, prepaid and encrypted, a lifeline I had almost despaired of ever using. I needed to reach out. Not to another corporate drone, not to someone still entangled in the web, but to an outsider. Someone who understood the rot, who had seen the system fail, and who perhaps, just perhaps, still harbored a flicker of defiant fire. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from deeper within the hold, followed by the scrape of heavy machinery. My breath hitched. Footsteps approached, heavy and measured, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. They weren't looking for me, not yet, but any discovery would be catastrophic. Through a narrow gap in the stacked cargo, I watched. 2 figures, burly and indistinct in the gloom, wrestled with a thick canvas tarp, pulling it back from a series of wooden crates. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the gloom. The crates weren't labeled with the usual shipping manifests. There was no company logo, no destination port, just a series of stark, almost crudely stenciled symbols: a jagged, stylized bird, an interlocking knot, a single upward-pointing arrow. These were not the markings of legitimate commerce. My mind, despite the fear, began to catalog, to connect. I had seen similar, though not identical, symbols in the periphery of my investigations. They were faint, almost subliminal, on the edges of some of the shell company documents, hidden in the metadata of encrypted files. I had dismissed them as meaningless flourishes, then stray marks. One of the figures grunted, leveraging a crowbar. The wood splintered, revealing the contents within. My breath caught. Not electronics, not textiles, not the usual bulk goods. The crates were filled with meticulously packed, sealed plastic containers, and within those containers, visible even in the dim light, were stacks of freshly minted currency. Not just one denomination, but a dizzying array. Crisp euros, pristine dollars, bundles of yen. It was more than just money. It was a physical manifestation of the laundering I had uncovered, moving across oceans, untraceable except for the meticulous paper trail I had followed. This wasn't just a transport, this was a mobile vault, a floating bank for illicit gains. The sheer audacity of it, the open disregard for any authority, solidified the truth. This was a global artery of their operation. This was the event. This was the reveal. My internal reports had been dismissed as speculative, my theories as paranoid. The syndicate wasn't just moving numbers on a screen. They were moving mountains of physical cash, right under the nose of international law. The jagged bird symbol, the knot, the arrow, they were not flourishes. They were the brand, the mark of ownership, a silent boast. My hands trembled as I carefully retrieved the satellite phone. The risk was immense. A stray signal, a momentary lapse in encryption, and I was done. But the alternative was to remain a prisoner, a witness to their silent, relentless march. I scrolled through the few preloaded contacts, my thumb hovering over a name I hadn't dared to consider until now, the disillusioned agent. A former federal investigator, known for a spectacular fall from grace, a career destroyed by accusations of insubordination, and a relentless pursuit of a truth too inconvenient for the powers that be. He was a pariah, a ghost in the system, but he was also, I suspected, unbought. I pressed the call button. The satellite struggled, a faint hum preceding a series of anxious beeps. Each second stretched into an eternity. Had the number been disconnected, was he even still alive? I have something critical, something about the symbols, the bird, the knot, the arrow. I knew mentioning the symbols was a gamble, a test. If he knew, if he understood, he might listen. If he didn't, he'd dismiss me as another madman. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, the flicker of recognition. The symbols, he repeated, the weariness in his voice replaced by a sudden razor-sharp edge. You found them. Where are you, Thomas? You sound like you're calling from the bottom of the ocean. His skepticism was a wall, but beneath it I detected a tremor of intrigue, a spark of the old fire. It wasn't an invitation, not yet, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was a challenge. A dangerous door cracked open in the heart of my metal prison. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and brine, a claustrophobic cocktail that chafed against my throat. My world had shrunk to the rhythmic creak of shifting cargo and the distant, unseen churn of the propellers. Each beat a slow drum count towards an uncertain fate. I had mapped my prison in the dim, sporadic light filtering from a single vent high above, memorizing the precarious towers of crates, the narrow canyons between them, the shadowed alcoves that offered a semblance of concealment. Hope, a fragile thing, clung to the notion that I might simply be an inconvenient stowaway to be offloaded, not a target. That fragile hope shattered with the abrupt clang of the main hatch above. This was no routine check. The sound was too sharp, too final. Heavy boots, not the captain's shuffling gait, descended the metal ladder. 2 pairs. My breath hitched, a knot tightening in my chest. They weren't looking for cargo. They were looking for me. I pressed myself deeper into the crevice between a towering stack of lumber and a crate marked with an unfamiliar stylized symbol, its edges rough against my cheek. The ship's roll, a gentle sway moments before, now felt like a deliberate lurch, a complicit tremor beneath my feet. The voices, guttural and low, were a language I did not recognize, yet their intent was universally clear in the sharp bark of command, the impatient scrape of a boot against metal. The beam of the torch swept closer, a predatory eye scanning my sanctuary. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself into invisibility, a foolish plea to the echoing vastness of the hold. Then, a sudden, jarring crash. One of them, a bulky figure whose silhouette filled the narrow gap at the end of my hiding place, had kicked open a smaller, less secure crate directly opposite me. Splinters flew, and a cascade of what looked like neatly packaged electronics spilled onto the grimy floor. My heart, A trapped bird hammered against my ribs, threatening to betray me with its frantic rhythm. I had to move. A desperate plan, thin as a spider's silk, began to weave itself in my mind. The ship's incessant motion, once a torment, could now be my ally. As the vessel dipped into a trough, sending a shudder through the hold, I lunged not away but towards the scattering of electronics. It felt like a miniature, self-contained world. The lean figure shouted, his torch beam pinning me against the stacked cargo for a terrifying instant. Stop! The word, though foreign, was sharp, a whip crack in the echoing space. I scrambled, using the momentum of the ship's next roll to propel myself into the labyrinth of crates. The bulky figure roared, his heavy footsteps thudding behind me, interspersed with the lighter, quicker strides of his companion. The hold transformed into a brutal obstacle course. I scaled a wall of canvas-wrapped bundles, my fingers tearing on rough twine, then dropped into the narrow gap between two enormous, vibrating engine parts. The air here was thick with oil, the metallic tang almost choking. They were gaining. I could hear their strained breathing, the frustrated curses, the clatter as they knocked over smaller items in their pursuit. My lungs burned, each gasp a ragged saw blade in my throat. I was not built for this, a man of ledgers and quiet offices, not a rat fleeing a trap in a metal box. I imagined its contents, a condensed universe of numbers and names, a truth that could not be dismissed. I dove under a low-slung conveyor belt, the rough metal scraping my back, emerging into a section filled with towering crates of textiles. The smell of fresh cotton and synthetic fibers was a strange, almost cruel contrast to the grim hunt. I could hear them arguing, their voices muffled by the fabric, debating which way I had gone. A brief respite, a gift. I pressed my ear against a crate, catching snippets of their frustrated exchange. One of them, the leaner one, seemed to be urging caution, a more methodical approach. The other, driven by brute force, wanted to simply smash through. This moment of disagreement, a fracture in their unified intent, was my sliver of opportunity. I saw a narrow passage, barely wide enough for my shoulders, leading deeper into the ship's belly towards the stern. It looked like a service corridor, usually locked but perhaps left ajar by a hurried crewman. Hope, that fickle flicker, returned. I squeezed through, the rough edges of the passage tearing at my clothes, my skin. Behind me, I heard a frustrated bellow, then the sound of splintering wood as the bulky figure evidently decided to create his own path. I didn't look back. The passage opened into a smaller, equally cluttered hold, but this one seemed less frequently visited. Dust motes danced in the sparse light from a single, grimy bulb, illuminating forgotten machinery shrouded in tarpaulins. My chest heaved, a painful symphony of effort. I stumbled, my knee buckling, and instinctively braced myself against a rusty bulkhead. My fingers brushed against a small recess panel, a forgotten access point. It was unlocked. A crawl space, perhaps, or a conduit for pipes. It was too small for either of them. A desperate final gamble. I lay there listening to the frantic search outside, the growing frustration in their voices, the heavy thudding of footsteps fading as they gave up on this section of the hold. They believed I had vanished, melted into the ship's metallic skin. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. I was alive for now. Its surface was smooth, cool, and a faint, almost imperceptible warmth emanated from it, a silent hum of power. This wasn't just evidence. This was a lifeline, a tangible link to the truth that had almost consumed me. The encounter had not broken me, it had hardened me. The cargo ship hold, 3 days from port, had become a crucible. I was no longer merely investigating. I was fighting for my life, and this tiny device was my newest, most potent weapon. The air was thick with the metallic tang of rust, and the faint, oily breath of diesel, a stagnant soup I had come to accept as my atmosphere. My world had shrunk to the rhythmic groan of the ship's hull against the relentless sea, the slap of waves, a muffled, insistent whisper against the metal skin of my prison. Each day bled into the next, marked only by the clatter of a food tray and the brief, blinding flash of a handheld lamp. My thoughts, once a meticulously organized ledger of facts and figures, had become a frantic, repetitive scroll. I replayed every conversation, every suspicious email, every late-night session poring over the firm's digital archives. The intricate web of shell companies, the phantom transactions, the dizzying sums disappearing into the ether, it had all seemed so clear, so undeniably real. Now, adrift in this iron box, a creeping doubt began to gnaw at the edges of my certainty. Had I seen too much or merely imagined patterns in the noise? There was the grand conspiracy, a fabrication of my own overstressed mind. On what I presumed was the fourth day, a sudden jarring clang echoed through the hold. The hatch groaned open, not for a food tray, but for a beam of raw, unadulterated light that stabbed at my eyes. I squinted, my vision blurring as a silhouette filled the opening. It wasn't the captain, but a taller, broader figure flanked by two others. My heart gave a tired thump, a dull drum against my ribs. This wasn't a routine check. Thomas, a voice rumbled deeper than the captain's, devoid of any discernible accent, carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. Your journey is almost over, though not in the way you might have hoped. I was pulled roughly from the hold, blinking against the stark light of the ship's deck. The sky was a vast, indifferent canvas of gray. The wind whipped at my clothes, carrying the sharp scent of salt and diesel. My legs, stiff from days of confinement, threatened to give out, but the grip on my arms was unyielding. I was led to a cramped cabin, far more plush than my recent quarters, where a man sat behind a small, bolted-down desk. He was impeccably dressed, a stark contrast to the grime and salt of the ship. He didn't look up immediately, instead tapping at a sleek tablet. The screen glowed with familiar graphics, a spreadsheet, a ledger, my ledger. His eyes were like chips of obsidian, utterly devoid of warmth. He rotated the tablet slightly, displaying the screen towards me. My breath hitched. There, displayed in stark, irrefutable detail, were transactions. Millions of dollars, funneled through the very shell corporations I had painstakingly uncovered. Except the trail led back to me. My login credentials, my digital signature, my personal accounts now bloated with sums I had never seen, never touched. Fabricated emails seemingly from me, authorizing transfers, discussing illicit payments, even outlining a plan to sell proprietary firm data to a rival conglomerate, corporate espionage, embezzlement. The words screamed in my mind, each syllable a hammer blow. A rather elaborate scheme, wouldn't you say? The man continued, a hint of amusement in his tone. The firm's internal auditors found it quite compelling. A shame, really, such a promising career. My mind raced, grappling with the impossible. That's not possible, I rasped, my voice hoarse. I didn't. Your fingerprints are all over it. Digital, physical, even a few choice witness accounts from certain colleagues who remember you expressing dissatisfaction, ambition perhaps that outstripped your position. A colleague who? The thought was a fresh stab of betrayal. They've already moved, he explained, his eyes never leaving mine as if savoring my unraveling. Your access has been revoked, your accounts frozen. The authorities are quite interested in your whereabouts. Your family, I imagine, will be receiving a visit soon to understand your sudden disappearance and the rather significant debt you've left them with. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. My family, my wife, my children, they would be exposed to this filth, branded by my supposed crimes. The image of their faces, bewildered and hurt, flashed before my eyes, a sharper pain than any physical blow. They wouldn't understand. They would believe the official story, the overwhelming evidence. They have nothing to do with this. Oh, but they do, Thomas, the man purred, leaning forward slightly. They are my weakness, my leverage, just as my meticulous nature was ours. I built the perfect map and we merely changed the destination. A wave of nausea washed over me. Everything I had worked for, every late night, every ethical choice, every sacrifice obliterated. Not just my career, but my reputation, my good name, twisted into something grotesque. I was a fugitive, a criminal, not an accountant seeking justice. The truth, my truth, was buried under a mountain of engineered lies. And I was here on a ship days from shore, unable to speak, unable to defend myself, utterly alone. My hands clenched, nails digging into my palms. Despair, a heavy, suffocating blanket, threatened to smother me. This was it, they had won. But as the icy tendrils of ruin tightened around me, a flicker ignited deep within. A stubborn, defiant ember. I knew what I hadn't done. I knew the real figures, the true culprits. This intricate framing, this perfect storm of lies, was itself a clue. It was too perfect, too clean, too convenient. They had underestimated one thing: my memory and the burning certainty of my innocence. If they wanted me to be a ghost, then I would haunt them. The steel shell of the cargo ship hold breathed around me, a colossal, rhythmic sigh that vibrated through the floor plates, up my spine, and into the marrow of my bones. 3 days from port, the captain had grunted, his gaze as flat and gray as the ocean outside this metal coffin. 3 days. 3 days until what? Until I was delivered to another anonymous location, another chapter in this nightmare, or perhaps simply to oblivion. The memory of my name, Thomas, felt like a whisper in a storm, almost lost to the roar of this monstrous vessel. My reputation, my carefully built life, shattered into 1,000 fragments scattered across a financial landscape now hostile and unforgiving. I was a ghost, a phantom accused of crimes I had only sought to expose. Nausea still coiled in my gut, a bitter companion, but beneath it a new heat began to smolder. Despair, I found, could be a strange crucible. When everything is stripped away, the title, the office, the comforting routine, what remains is raw, elemental will. They had taken my name, twisted my truth, but they had not, could not, take the mind that had unraveled their intricate lies. That mind, honed over decades of sifting through ledgers and balance sheets, was all I had left, and it was perhaps more dangerous than any weapon. I pressed my back against a cold, corrugated wall, the vibration a constant thrum against my skull, and closed my eyes. The hold smelled of diesel fumes, salt, and the stale air of confinement. My world had shrunk to this dim, clanging box, yet within it, the vast, intricate network of their deceit began to unfurl in my memory. The shell corporations, like a nest of vipers, each one feeding the next. The offshore accounts, a shimmering mirage of anonymity. The complex circular transfers designed to obscure the origin and destination of fortunes. I had seen them all, mapped their flows, understood their logic, or rather, their cunning illogic. My fingers, usually dancing across a keyboard, now traced imaginary lines on the grimy steel. Each line was a transaction, each point a numbered account. I remembered the obscure subsidiary in a jurisdiction notorious for its lax oversight, the one that always seemed to receive just enough to stay below the radar of routine audits. I recalled the series of numbered accounts, a chain stretching from a seemingly legitimate investment fund to a ghost entity in a distant archipelago. It was all there, etched into the forensic pathways of my mind. And then, a flicker. A pattern I had dismissed as noise, an anomaly too small to register amidst the flood of larger sums. There had been a recurring series of microtransactions, small, almost negligible transfers, always to the same obscure charity. At the time, my team and I had flagged them as potential operational errors, perhaps even a clumsy attempt at legitimate philanthropy to offset larger illicit gains. We'd moved on, focusing on the millions, the billions. But now, in the oppressive solitude of the cargo hold, a chilling clarity descended. The charity was a front, of course, a transparent veil, but the amounts, they weren't random. They were specific, almost deliberately peculiar: 1,776.49, then 3,088.02, then 1,776.49 again, but from a different shell. A sequence. Not a numerical formula, but a unique signature. A fingerprint left in the dust of their grand larceny, so small, so seemingly insignificant that no one would bother to trace it. No one, perhaps, but a meticulous accountant with nothing left to lose but his life. This wasn't an error. It was a coded message, a unique marker. A direct line, I now understood, to the true architect, the puppet master who controlled the entire elaborate dance of illicit funds, separating himself by an additional layer of transactional obscurity. This was the wait that doesn't add up moment I'd been searching for, hidden in plain sight. My breath hitched. The pieces clattered into place with the precision of a tumblers in a lock. The specific, non-sequential numbers, the odd cents, the recurring nature across seemingly disparate accounts, it pointed to a single, consistent hand. Not the visible faces, the corporate executives I had initially suspected, but someone deeper, someone who used these minor transactions as a private, almost artistic flourish to confirm their control, a silent nod to their own genius. This was the reveal. This was the thread, fragile but strong, that could unravel the entire tapestry. A fierce resolve solidified within me. This information, this signature, had to be exposed. It had to be public, undeniable. A broadcast that would echo through every financial institution and news outlet, leaving no room for denial or obfuscation. But how? From a metal box hurtling across the ocean. My gaze swept the hold, taking in the towering stacks of crated goods, the heavy machinery lashed down with thick chains, the single, sealed door that was my only exit. I had no phone, no computer, no way to communicate. Could I truly unravel a web so vast from this cramped steel tomb? They were too powerful, too entrenched. I was just Thomas, an accountant, stripped of everything. But then the image of my family, their faces blurred by distance and danger, flashed in my mind. Their safety, their future depended on me. I had to become more than an accountant. I had to become an adversary. My intellect, my memory, my understanding of their system, these were my weapons. The plan began to form, intricate and audacious, like the most complex financial architecture I had ever devised. It hinged on a principle I knew well: leverage. I would use their own system against them. The cargo, the ship itself, the very act of my transport, each element became a potential tool. The 3 days. It wasn't just a countdown to my potential doom. It was a deadline, a ticking clock to execute my countermove. I would need to find a way to access the ship's communication, however rudimentary. I would need to encode my message, making it appear innocuous until it reached the right eyes that would recognize the specific numerical signature I had uncovered. It would be a message within a message, a financial Trojan horse. I began to mentally draft the key points, the irrefutable evidence. The shell companies by name, the dates of the key transfers, the specific offshore accounts, and above all, that unique, recurring numerical signature. It was a language only a forensic accountant would truly understand, a language that spoke of absolute guilt. The game was far from over. It had only just begun. 3 days. 3 days to unleash a tempest. My fingers, calloused now from unfamiliar tasks, danced across the worn keys of the rugged laptop. The screen, a pale rectangle of light in the cavernous gloom, displayed a lattice of numbers, dates, and names, the skeleton of a financial empire built on stolen breath and broken trust. Each keystroke was a hammer blow, shaping the truth into an undeniable weapon. I wasn't merely altering data. I was crafting a digital bomb, embedding a secondary layer of proof, an immutable timestamp that would scream its authenticity even if the primary files were erased 1,000 times over. This was the ghost in the machine, the phantom ledger that would expose the true architects. The air, thick with the scent of diesel and the metallic tang of salt, pressed in. My breath plumed faintly in the cool air, each exhalation a small, visible prayer. The silence, punctuated only by the ship's deep thrum, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by a misplaced step, a creaking bulkhead. Paranoia, a constant companion now, whispered at the edges of my hearing, suggesting footsteps where there were none, shadows shifting just beyond my peripheral vision. I reminded myself. The cargo master, placated by a thick envelope and a fabricated story of a personal project, believed me locked away, tinkering with inventory manifests. A flimsy shield, but for now it held. The first phase, the data manipulation. I burrowed deeper into the hidden directories, the ghost files I'd copied from the firm's servers weeks ago, the ones I knew the internal auditors had deliberately overlooked. My plan was a delicate web. Release the initial, obvious layers of the laundering scheme, then, after the initial chaos, trigger the deeper, more damning revelations. This staggered release, I hoped, would prevent them from simply burying the whole truth under a mountain of counter-narratives. It would force them to react, to expose themselves further. A line of code glowed, a sequence I'd spent sleepless nights perfecting. It was a worm, designed to activate at a precise moment, not to destroy, but to illuminate. It would cross-reference the firm's public financial statements with the encrypted ledgers I was now perfecting, generating an irrefutable discrepancy report. This wasn't just about money. It was about the systemic rot, the deliberate blindness, the complicity. As I worked, a peculiar entry surfaced, not within the laundering scheme itself, but nestled in a seemingly innocuous audit trail from years prior. It was a series of transfers, small and irregular, routed through a shell company I recognized, not as part of the current syndicate's usual network, but one linked to an older, almost forgotten scandal. My brow furrowed. Wait, that doesn't add up. This particular shell company, Crimson Tide Holdings, had been declared defunct after a minor embezzlement case, its records supposedly purged. Yet here it was, a phantom limb, showing activity that mirrored the current scheme's earliest, most embryonic stages. The amounts were negligible, a mere trickle, but the dates. They predated the current syndicate's known inception by almost a decade. Reveal/discovery. This wasn't just a new thread, it was a root. Crimson Tide Holdings wasn't defunct. It was a dormant account, occasionally stirred, a pilot project. And the transfers, tiny as they were, consistently ended up in a fund managed by the senior partner of my own firm, a man named Henderson, not as part of his official compensation, but as personal, undeclared income. Not the grand mastermind, perhaps, but certainly a foundational pillar, a silent enabler for decades, allowing the current syndicate to grow under his protective shadow. The scale of the deceit stretched further back, deeper into the foundations of my professional life than I had ever dared to imagine. The betrayal felt like a fresh wound. My hands stilled for a moment, the rhythmic hum of the ship now a dull roar in my ears. Henderson. The very man who had once praised my meticulousness, who had lectured on integrity. It wasn't just an external threat. The serpent had been coiled within the very edifice I had dedicated my life to. I forced myself back to the task, my resolve hardening into something sharp and unforgiving. The second phase, covert communication. From a specially shielded pouch, I extracted a device no bigger than my thumb, a single-burst satellite transmitter. It was a relic from a brief, misguided obsession with off-grid survival, repurposed for a far more critical mission. It had one purpose: to send a pre-encrypted, time-delayed signal to a single recipient. I had chosen the recipient with agonizing care, a retired investigative journalist, known only as the Oracle among his peers, a man Thomas had never met but whose reputation for relentless truth-seeking was legendary. Weeks ago, under a false identity, I had mailed him a dead drop package, a secure USB drive containing a fraction of the initial data, along with instructions. The signal I was about to send was the activation key, the trigger for him to publish. It would also contain the location of a second, larger data package, designed to drop into the public domain 48 hours later, a full exposé built around the Crimson Tide Holdings' revelation and Henderson's silent complicity. I extended the device's tiny antenna, a thread-thin filament that seemed impossibly fragile against the vastness of the ocean and sky. The hold's steel walls were a formidable barrier. I'd have to find a moment, a sliver of opportunity, perhaps when a hatch was briefly opened for a ventilation check, or a maintenance crew passed through. The captain's route had been carefully charted, and I knew that in precisely 42 minutes, the ship would pass through a narrow band of relatively clear satellite coverage, a fleeting window. What if the signal failed? What if the Oracle dismissed my package as a hoax? The sheer audacity of my plan, born of desperation, suddenly felt like a house of cards against a hurricane. My breath hitched. My family. Their faces, sharp and clear, flashed behind my eyelids. The image of them safe, free, was the only anchor against the rising tide of fear. No, failure was not an option. I keyed in the final command for the data bomb, setting its internal clock. The screen flickered, then displayed a confirmation. Initiated. Countdown engaged. Now the waiting. The ship continued its relentless journey, carrying me, a ghost in its belly, towards a confrontation that would either shatter an empire or shatter me. 3 days until the world would see, and 3 days for them to find me. The rhythmic thrum of the engines was a pulse against my very bones, a relentless countdown in the deep belly of the cargo ship hold, 3 days from port. Each metallic groan, each surge of the dark ocean outside, whispered of the precipice I approached. My palm still remembered the chill of the satellite device, a small, unassuming block of circuits and resolve, now tucked into a hidden compartment of my worn travel bag. It held the truth, a digital venom meticulously extracted from the firm's pristine ledgers, ready to poison the syndicate's carefully constructed empire. 3 days had dwindled to mere hours. The air, thick with the scent of diesel and brine, felt heavy with anticipation, pressing down on my chest. I had become a wraith in this floating steel behemoth, a ghost of my former meticulous self, now honed to a single desperate purpose. There was no turning back. The path behind me was scorched earth, the path ahead a crucible. When the ship finally docked, its monstrous silhouette dwarfing the bustling port cranes, a strange calm settled over me. The chaos of unloading, the shouts of the dock workers, the metallic clang of containers, it all swirled around me, yet I felt utterly detached, a single-minded arrow released from its bowstring. Slipping past the weary eyes of the customs agent, my face a carefully constructed mask of disinterest, I stepped onto solid ground. The city lights, a glittering tapestry against the bruised twilight sky, beckoned and repelled in equal measure. This was their domain, their fortress of lies, and tonight I would breach its walls. My destination was the grand ballroom of the city's most opulent hotel, hosting the annual corporate gala, a glittering charade where the architects of my nightmare would bask in their ill-gotten glory. I had acquired a guest list, memorized faces, and rehearsed my entry, a phantom in borrowed finery. The ballroom was a symphony of crystal chandeliers, hushed laughter, and the clinking of champagne flutes. I moved through the throng, a silent observer in a sea of performative smiles. My eyes scanned the room, searching for the familiar predatory gleam in the eyes of the firm's senior partner, the quiet menace of the head of security. There they were. The senior partner, a man whose silver hair and benevolent smile had once commanded my respect, now looked like a polished viper, holding court by a towering floral arrangement. Beside him, the head of security, a mountain of a man with eyes that missed nothing, surveyed the room with an almost casual vigilance. And then, a figure I had only glimpsed in the periphery of danger, the syndicate's liaison, a quiet man in impeccable tailoring, sipping mineral water, his gaze drifting over the opulent scene with an unsettling calm, like a predator observing its territory. My heart, usually a steady drum, began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a wild bird trapped. Doubt, a fleeting, icy tendril, tried to coil around my resolve. What if I fail? What if they stop me before the signal transmits? I pushed it back, a desperate shove against the encroaching fear. My family, my integrity, the very fabric of truth demanded this moment. I found my pre-selected vantage point, a discreet alcove near the floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a clear line of sight to the city's vast, indifferent sky. My hands, despite my training, trembled slightly as I retrieved the satellite device. Its small indicator light glowed a faint, steady green. I had preloaded the encrypted data packet, the ledgers, the shell corporations, the illicit transactions, the names, the dates, the irrefutable links to the syndicate's global network. Everything. Thomas. A voice, sharp and disbelieving, cut through the din. It was the senior partner, his benevolent smile suddenly replaced by a grimace of recognition and alarm. His eyes, usually so calculating, widened fractionally. He had seen me. The head of security immediately stiffened, his head snapping towards me, his casual vigilance dissolving into focused menace. My moment had arrived, sooner than expected, more abrupt. There was no time for preamble, no time for theatrical pronouncements. I had to act. My fingers flew, activating the device. A small, almost imperceptible hum emanated from it as the internal modem began to connect. "I can't do this, Thomas," the senior partner hissed, his voice dropping though the underlying fury vibrated through the air. He started to move, a slow, deliberate approach like a shark circling. The head of security was already striding purposefully, cutting through the oblivious guests with silent efficiency. His eyes, however, held a deadly glint. "It's already done," I murmured, my voice barely audible even to myself, yet imbued with a steel I hadn't known I possessed. The device pulsed once, a tiny, triumphant flash of blue. The data was streaming, a silent flood of truth, bypassing their firewalls, their secure networks, hurtling through the ionosphere towards the pre-programmed secure server, the final repository for the authorities. My finger hovered over the final activation sequence, the broadcast. My gaze, however, was fixed on the syndicate liaison across the room. He gave an almost imperceptible nod to someone I couldn't see, and suddenly, two other figures, lean and quick, began to converge from different directions. "No!" The senior partner bellowed, his composure shattering, his voice momentarily cutting through the ballroom's murmur. It was too late. I pressed the button. A silent, invisible wave of information surged from the device outwards, upwards. The blue light on the satellite device turned solid, triumphant. It was out. The world would know. The truth, painstakingly unearthed, was now beyond their reach, broadcasting its damning verdict to the waiting digital ears of justice. The head of security lunged, his fingers closing around my arm with crushing force. Pain flared, sharp and immediate. I dropped the device, but it didn't matter. Its work was done. The elegant façade of the gala was beginning to crack, the perfect illusion of wealth and power splintering around me. The music faltered. My arm was twisted behind me, a sharp, white-hot agony. It was done. The empire was falling. And I, Thomas, the unassuming number cruncher, stood at its precipice, battered but unbroken, knowing the truth had finally been set free. My palm still remembered the chill of the satellite phone, its single, desperate signal cast into the void. Had it found its mark? Or had my final gamble merely echoed into the indifferent expanse of the sky? The air in the hold, thick with the scent of diesel and sea salt, felt heavier with each passing hour. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and calculation, was now a fractured pane, reflecting 1,000 anxieties. Every creak of the hull was a potential footstep, every distant clang a harbinger of discovery. When the ship's engines finally quieted, replaced by the mournful cry of gulls and the distant clamor of a working harbor, a tremor ran through me. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was the jolt of an inevitable impact. The vast metal doors of the hold groaned open, spilling harsh daylight into my sanctuary. Figures stood silhouetted against the blinding sun, not the syndicate's enforcers, but uniformed officers, their expressions stern, their weapons held with professional readiness. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it threatened to buckle my knees, washed over me. I had survived the journey, but the true reckoning had only just begun. A lead investigator, a woman with eyes that seemed to weigh every word, met me on the dock. His gaze was not unkind but piercing, sifting through the layers of my ordeal. "Thomas," he said, his voice a quiet counterpoint to the bustling port. "We received my message. It was comprehensive." The word comprehensive felt like an understatement, a clinical label for the frantic scribbles, the hidden ledgers, the coded messages I'd compiled and sent. I felt a strange detachment as I recounted the tale, the words spilling out, each detail a shard of the nightmare I had lived. I watched her face, searching for disbelief, but found only a growing recognition. Her nods were slow, deliberate. "The arrests began 12 hours ago." Another officer chimed in, consulting a small device. "Multiple locations. My firm's senior partners, the finance director, several key figures in the European network. The edifice, so grand and imposing, had crumbled. My old life, once defined by its polished marble and hushed corridors, was now a crime scene. I pictured the headlines, the flashing lights, the scandal erupting like a toxic bloom. My name, once synonymous with meticulous accounting, would now forever be linked to this catastrophe. This knowledge, while vindicating, carried a heavy price. The quiet dignity of my former existence was irrevocably shattered. Days blurred into a series of interviews, secure locations, and the dizzying unraveling of the syndicate's threads. The initial skepticism I'd encountered from some of the agents gradually melted away as my evidence aligned perfectly with their ongoing, albeit fragmented, investigations. Among the seized assets of one of the arrested partners, a seemingly innocuous offshore account had been found. It contained a significant sum, but the strange part was its purpose. Not directly funding syndicate operations, but consistently paying for advanced cybersecurity services for a specific shell company. This shell company, I learned, was one I had flagged early on as suspicious, but had been explicitly told to disregard by the finance director. It had been a phantom, a whisper in the data, seemingly disconnected. Why would a money launderer be investing in top-tier protection for an account that wasn't directly part of their main operations? I mused aloud to the lead investigator, tracing a pattern on the table with my finger. It's like protecting a single, empty vault with the same security as the main bank. She paused, her brow furrowed. Unless it wasn't empty, or wasn't meant to stay empty, or perhaps its purpose was to hide something else entirely, something so vital it needed its own separate, impenetrable shroud. The implication hung in the air, a new, subtle disquiet. The arrests were significant, the syndicate crippled, but this small, isolated detail felt like a loose thread on an otherwise perfectly tailored garment. It hinted at a deeper layer, a hidden compartment within the labyrinth I thought I had fully mapped. The firm was facing unprecedented legal action, its reputation in tatters, its assets frozen. My name, once tainted by false accusations, was now cleared, publicly affirmed by the very authorities who had once viewed me with suspicion. Yet, the emotional cost was a weight I carried like a phantom limb. The faces of my family, their worry etched deep, flashed before me. The quiet life I cherished, the predictable rhythm of numbers and routine, was gone, replaced by a raw, exposed vulnerability. The law enforcement agents, relentless in their pursuit, continued to dismantle the remaining tendrils of the international network. The lead investigator confirmed that the syndicate, though wounded, still possessed fragments of its power, but the coordinated global assault had left it reeling. I stood by a window in a government safe house, watching the city lights flicker below. The ordeal had stripped me bare, revealing a core of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. But it had also left scars, invisible yet profound. The world, once a place of ordered systems and clear outcomes, now seemed a vast, complex web of hidden agendas and dangerous currents. My old life was irrevocably lost, a casualty of truth. What remained was a path forged in fire, uncertain but undeniably mine. The battle was won, but the quiet war within, the one for my own peace, had only just begun. The metallic groan of the vessel was a lullaby of steel, a rhythm I had come to accept as my world for these passing days. I stood within the cavernous cargo ship hold, 3 days from port, the air thick with the scent of brine and distant diesel. Above, a single, unshaded bulb cast a sickly yellow glow on crates stacked like silent sentinels, their contents a mystery to me, much like the future that now stretched before my family and me. The arrests had been a thunderclap, echoing across continents, severing the visible tentacles of the syndicate. Yet that final, almost imperceptible tremor, The one that whispered of a deeper, more insidious current had clung to me like a phantom limb. It wasn't a name, not a ledger entry, but a pattern. A subtle deviation in the flow of information, not money. The way certain reports had been delayed, not suppressed. How particular inquiries had been redirected, not stonewalled. It spoke not of active malice from within my former firm, but a chilling indifference, a strategic blindness cultivated over years. The firm's senior partner, a man whose smile had always been too wide, whose handshake too firm, had not been a conspirator in the grand scheme. He had merely been a master of plausible deniability, a sculptor of convenient ignorance, allowing the rot to fester for the sake of quarterly earnings and an undisturbed ascent. He hadn't pulled the strings of the laundering. He had simply ensured the stage lights remained dim enough for the puppeteers to operate unseen. This realization, born of quiet contemplation aboard the endless expanse of the sea, was the final, bitter drop in a chalice of hard-won truth. It meant the corruption wasn't just a foreign entity infiltrating. It was also a cancerous growth within the very foundations of the institutions I once revered. My hand, scarred faintly from a hurried escape, traced the rough metal of a container. The salt spray that occasionally misted through the open hatch felt cleansing, a stark contrast to the suffocating air of deceit I had breathed for so long. The fear hadn't entirely dissipated. It had merely receded, leaving behind a persistent hum of vigilance. The journey had given me space, a vast, indifferent canvas against which to sketch the outline of a new life. My son's laughter, when I finally heard it again, would be the truest melody. My wife's embrace, the firmest anchor. The thought of their resilience, their unwavering trust despite the chaos I unwittingly dragged them into, was a powerful balm. We were survivors, not just of a physical threat, but of a shattering of innocence, a forced awakening to the world's true face. 3 days from port, 3 days from a new shore, a new name, a new beginning. They were guardians of a fragile peace, their presence a constant reminder of the perils we had navigated. I pictured the small coastal town, the quiet house the authorities had arranged. Not a fortress, but a haven, a place where the scent of the ocean would replace the sterile smell of balance sheets, where the rhythm of waves would supplant the frantic ticking of a financial clock. My career as a forensic accountant, once a source of quiet pride, now felt tainted, a profession too easily warped by avarice. The numbers, once a source of comfort, had become instruments of exposure, revealing the grotesque underbelly of wealth. I thought of the documents I had meticulously compiled, the data I had painstakingly decrypted. They were now in the hands of the authorities, a testament to the truth, a legacy of my unwilling transformation. The evidence, the irrefutable proofs, had spoken louder than any threat, had cut through the layers of obstruction and misdirection. The syndicate was crippled, its vast network fractured. The arrests had reached high, ensnaring powerful figures who had once seemed untouchable. The victory, though hard-won and scarred, was undeniable. But what now for Thomas? The meticulous number cruncher, the man who found solace in order and certainty, had been irrevocably altered. The quiet life, the one I had once craved, now felt insufficient. Not one of grand heroism, but of quiet service. A role where my meticulous eye for detail, my tenacity for truth, could be wielded for the public good, free from the entanglements of corporate greed. A path where the intricate dance of numbers could serve justice, not obfuscation. It would be a different kind of fight, less overt but no less crucial. The ship's horn blared, a deep, resonant cry that seemed to echo my own unspoken resolution. It was a sound of passage, of departure, and of a cautious, nascent hope. The past was a brutal teacher, its lessons etched deep into my soul. But it had also gifted me clarity, a new lens through which to view the world. My family, my true north, would be my strength. And with them, on this new horizon, I would find my way. The journey had been perilous, the transformation agonizing, but I was no longer merely Thomas, the accountant. I was Thomas, the survivor, the witness, the man forged in fire, ready to build anew. The tension remained, a subtle thrum beneath the surface, a reminder of the fragility of peace, but it was now accompanied by a burgeoning sense of agency, a quiet confidence in the face of an uncertain dawn.